As you probably know, many of you are familiar faces, but those who are not will know that this lecture, as all our guest lectures, are held in memory of Professor Nigel Seeley, who was visiting professor at our institute. Previously, he was the head of conservation at the Institute of Archaeology, also here at UCL, before going on to be head of conservation at the National Trust. He was a tremendous supporter of our interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary endeavours, which were very new when we started out in 2001. And he died quite young, and we miss him and hold these lectures in his memory, because I'm sure that he would have really appreciated the eclectic mix of speakers that we have. And we're very privileged to have today Professor Norman MacLeod from the Natural History Museum, who will be talking on the subject, setting the modern biodiversity crisis in context. I'd just like to say a few words about Norman, who is Dean of Postgraduate Education and Training at the Natural History Museum in London. He is also Honorary Professor at the Department of Earth Sciences here at UCL, and Honorary Visiting Professor at Nanjing Institute of Geology and Paleontology, the Chinese Academy of Sciences in Nanjing, China. He has worked in the educational, research and private sectors, taught students at all levels from secondary school to postgraduate, trained and supervised the research of over 20 MSc and PhD students, and provided research and consultancy services to a wide range of commercial clients. Wait for this, guys. He's the author of over 400 publications, including 8 books. And we're very privileged, Norman, for you to join us today. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you, May. Thank you, Rachel. And thank you, Kim, for organizing this lecture. I was very privileged to be invited. I have to admit that it is with some trepidation that I take the stage here, because once I realized that this was a SEAHA event and that this was in honor of Nigel Seeley, then I wondered where my research, where my expertise was going to fit in. However, my mind was set at rest when I started doing some research, as it often is when you do research. Your mind is actually set at rest. And I came across this obituary of Seeley by Nicholas Barker, published in The Independent in 2004. I was struck by these phrases that cites Barker writing about Seeley. Scientific research applied to problems involved in the preservation of what has survived from the past is a relatively recent phenomenon. That became news to me as a paleontologist. But it goes on to say that individual objects in the environment in which they survive, people who research these objects have long been aware of the need to understand the physical, chemical, and biological facts involved with their study, but the realization that research not directly connected with any specific material problem is the key to success. Such research as a career is hardly even now established, even in academic circles. So I certainly relate to that, and given now that I know more about Professor Seeley's work in forensic sciences and across a wide range of fields, that I feel very comfortable being here talking to you tonight and delivering this lecture in honor of Professor Seeley. What I'm going to try and do tonight is take you through some history, some contemporary aspects of the biodiversity crisis problem, especially as it relates to extinctions, which is one of my special areas of expertise. And then go on to talk about the modern biodiversity crisis, which I'm sure all of you have heard aspects of. Many of the things that I'm going to touch on, you've heard before, you've heard the topics mentioned before, but I believe you'd be interested in the tape that I'll look at them, because rather than just reporting to you what other people have said, I'm going to talk to you as a practitioner of this research. And oftentimes the people that talk about these topics actually aren't practitioners. So to move right along, mass extinctions. Start jumping at the deep end. All of you probably have heard the term mass extinction. Mass extinction underway Many people believe that we have a problem in the modern world, and that indeed we are in the middle of a mass extinction episode. So this begs the question as to what is this thing that we are in the middle of? Where has this been the first mass extinction? Have there been other mass extinctions? Where have these extinctions happened? And what does this hold in store for us? When we go outside, it doesn't seem like anything particularly unusual is going on. Nevertheless, there does seem to be a lot of concern about this crisis that has to do with the extinction fates of modern organisms. I'm going to I'm going to organize my presentation here around these 5 questions. What is mass extinction? What are the patterns of mass extinction? What causes mass extinctions? Current status of the mass extinction controversy, and why should we care about biodiversity and mass extinction in the first place? We should probably care about mass extinction. Just to give a precursor answer to this, we should care about it because we are dependent on the services that are provided by the organisms around us. We cannot live on this planet without, unless we live beside other organisms. They provide us services, they provide us with our food, they provide us with our shelter, they provide us with all of the things that we need in order to inhabit our cultural, our built environment, our cultural environment, and indeed our aesthetic environment. And many people are concerned, many people regard natural organisms, the natural heritage, if you will, of the upper world as just as important as the cultural heritage, as the built heritage that the Institute for Sustainable Heritage is focused on. So this is really in line with that. In the natural history world, we keep having to put our hands up and say, yeah, we're part of history too. So let's talk first of all about what is this term mass extinction that gets thrown at us and people try to scare us with a lot. And they are scary things. Going back in the history of biodiversity, of course, back in the olden days, there wasn't any such thing as extinction. A benevolent creator created all of the plants and animals that we see around us. There wasn't anything else, and no one could imagine that the benevolent creator would have gone to the trouble of doing all of this work on our behalf, and then would allow anything to go extinct. So extinction wasn't an issue. Some people speculated that perhaps something might go extinct, and certainly people saw things coming and going from their local environments. But the idea that they didn't exist somewhere else really wasn't on the cards. It wasn't taken seriously until the late 1700s, early 1800s, when the study of the fossil record started to bring to light animals like this, or remains of animals like this. This is a mastodon. It was recovered from the Ohio region in the late 1700s. It was dubbed the American incognitum because nobody could figure out what it was. At first, it wasn't, the entire skeleton here wasn't recovered, just pieces, bones, teeth, that sort of thing. So this is typically the case with fossil organisms, especially vertebrate fossils, is you don't get the whole thing right at the beginning. Samples of this material was recovered by the local settlers. The French brought material back over to Europe, and some of the material made its way to Paris, other parts of the material made its way to London, and it caused quite a controversy among the burgeoning field of natural sciences in London and in Paris, because nobody could quite figure out what was going on here, what animals these things belonged to, or indeed whether they were animals at all. This was sorted out by Georges Cuvier, whose name I'm sure some of you recognize. He's the great anatomist, great French anatomist. Cuvier probably knew more about vertebrate anatomy than anyone else, and quickly recognized that the American incognitum was a proboscidean, it was an elephant, but it wasn't like either of the two modern species of elephant. And indeed, at that time, there weren't two modern species of elephant. There was only one species. Both the Indian elephant and the African elephant were subsumed into the same species. In the monograph where Cuvier discusses the American incognitum, Cuvier separated the Indian and the African elephant. So those species were created or recognized first as a result of Cuvier's work,
And Cuvier argued that this animal was not either of these. It was an elephant, it wasn't an Indian elephant, it wasn't an African elephant. And it was so large that he felt that it could not have escaped attention by the explorers that had been moving all over the Earth's surface and bringing specimens back to Europe at that time, for about 100 years at that time. So he said, this is probably an extinct elephant. And that was the first scientific, first credible scientific discovery, if you will, of an extinct animal of any sort, the one that was widely accepted by the scientific community. So extinction really began with Georges Cuvier in 1799. Cuvier was also responsible for another aspect of extinction studies, and that was the idea that extinctions may be sudden and catastrophic. Cuvier, in addition to his anatomical work, was interested in geology. At the time, many natural historians were interested in all aspects of natural history. So in his study of the Paris Basin with Brognard, Cuvier ran across horizons, stratigraphic horizons, in which organisms that clearly did not belong together, organisms that were freshwater and marine, were with the same deposits, in a chaotic manner. And taking the literal interpretation of the stratigraphic record, Cuvier and Brognard came to the conclusion that these deposits proved the existence of a world previous to theirs that was destroyed by some kind of catastrophe. Now this politically, in a socio-political sense, this received a great reception in Paris and in France because they were undergoing the French Revolution at the time. But for some people, some historians say, largely for socio-political reasons and also for scientific theoretical reasons, it really scared the bejesus out of people like Charles Darwin and Charles Lyell, who didn't want to have anything to do with catastrophic revolutions, either political or natural. Darwin, in his book on Origin of Species, took quite a different view from Cuvier, arguing that extinctions did exist. Extinctions were predicted on the basis of his theory of evolution by natural selection, but that they happened very gradually, in a stately and gradual manner, just like political change should happen in a stately and gradual manner, as opposed to bloody revolutions. In addition to that, Darwin speculated that the process of extinction probably took a longer time than the process of speciation. It's interesting to me, at least, that he juxtaposed extinction and speciation, because, of course, we now understand that extinction is a perfectly natural process. Indeed, second only to speciation in terms of its influence on biodiversity. So Darwin was the first to recognize the link between extinction and speciation, the very new phenomenon of extinction. A year after Darwin published his book on the origin of species, then John Phillips, who was the Secretary of the Royal Society at the time, published this diagram. This was the first summary of biodiversity history. This was based on a known fossil record at his time in the late 1800s, and tabulating what he knew about species ranges, the times the different fossil species lived, both marine and terrestrial. Then he drew up this very crude diagram that showed species increasing in frequency over time, and that the history of life is punctuated by, not only by a monotonic increase in diversity, but punctuated by at least two reductions in diversity. One at the transition between Paleozoic and Mesozoic, about 225 million years ago, and one at the transition between the Mesozoic and the Cenozoic, about 66 million years ago. They didn't know those dates at that time. But this was highly speculative. It wasn't really accepted very well or very completely by his colleagues, because they felt that the evidence of the fossil record was still too incomplete in order to draw up a summary and regard this summary as actually being an accurate portrayal of the history of biodiversity. Nevertheless, it exists in the literature. And it stayed that way, more or less, for 100 years. Until the time that Otto Schindewolf in Europe, Otto Schindewolf in Germany, and Norman Newell in the United States became interested in the question of extinction again. Between Phillips and the work of Schindewolf and Norman Newell, extinction was really treated as the negative side of evolution, as something that it was unfortunate, but nobody really was terribly interested in the idea of extinction. But Schindewolf and Newell reinvigorated scientific interest in the whole question of extinction, largely in the same way that Phillips did, by taking the data of the fossil record and plotting up biodiversity curves over time. Now, of course, Schindewolf and Newell had an extra 100 years worth of data to play with that John Phillips didn't have. And here in one of the better known curves redrawn from Newell in 1963, here we have Newell's summary of biodiversity history. And if we compare this to Phillips' summary, I think you can see the remarkable coincidence. These two summaries were drawn up over 100 years apart. We get the same cabling of diversification, biodiversification in the Paleozoic in both curves. We have the transition between the Mesozoic and the Paleozoic and the Mesozoic here, the extinction event in both curves. Newell missed the Cretaceous extinction, but he doesn't have very many data points up here. So that's no doubt why he missed that extinction event. But also the increase, especially the almost exponential increase in diversification from through the Mesozoic into Cenozoic. All of these are there in both curves. So Phillips' curve was actually better than people gave him credit for at the time. And everything that had happened between these two curves more or less was filling in the details. So quite a remarkable achievement, both for Phillips for realizing what the major patterns were, and also for Newell for reinvigorating interest. Note that Newell's data, Newell actually has a scale along this axis, number of families. It's upside down there, but go back to this diagram, number of families. So Newell was actually able to count families, and he was because the literature on species is so dispersed among the paleontological literature and the biological literature that it's very difficult to count species. So he decided to count families instead, and essentially got the same curve. Once this happened, people became very, very interested in tabulating species, and none more so than my light colleague Jack Sapkowski, who originally started this work when he was a graduate student at Harvard, and then continued it when he was at the New York State University of New York, and also lastly at the University of Chicago. Jack felt that his field area was actually the library rather than geological field areas. So he went to the field in the library and combed libraries for family level records, as many family level records as he could of stratigraphic ranges of fossils, put them together in one of the first paleontological databases, one of the first scientific databases as far as I'm aware, electronic scientific databases. And then started publishing a series of very innovative and informative papers about patterns that he saw through time in terms of biodiversification. And here from 1981 is Jack Sapkowski's diagram. Once again, very similar to Norman Newell's and very similar to John Phillips. In addition to noticing the tabling, the exponential increase in the early Paleozoic, tabling in the middle and late Paleozoic, the extinction in the Permo-Triassic, and then the exponential increase in the Cenozoic and Mesozoic, interrupted here by the Cretaceous extinction event, Jack also recognized that these diversification events were created by different cohorts of organisms. So we have a great diversification of trilobites, polychaete worms, monoplacophorian mollusks, and inarticulate brachiopods very early in the Paleozoic. And then these died out and were replaced by a different group of organisms. And these, at the Permo-Triassic boundary, died out, and then they were replaced by different group of organisms. We still speak in paleontological circles of Jack's 3 evolutionary faunas. It seems to be a progressive change in the types of organisms that have contributed most to biodiversification through time. And that's still with us. Now, the extinction record that I'm going to talk about is the little wriggles that are on top of this biodiversification diagram. And that's what I want to focus on, because the extinction diagram, the extinction is key to understanding what's happening to biodiversification and the fears for biodiversification in the modern world. These extinction events, as you can see here, these little wriggles have names. There's the Endorphian and Devonian event, the end Permian event, very large drop at the end of the Permian, the end of the Triassic event, and the end of the Cretaceous. There are, of course, other declines in biodiversity along with these, but these are the biggest ones. And they're the ones that people refer to commonly as mass extinctions. Here, once again, comparison of Jack's curve with Phillips' curve, and the remarkable correspondence between the two. Now, one of the things you can do with these diagrams, once you have a tabulation of how long species existed for, is you can start creating some actuarial tables. Now, all of you have a place on insurance actuarial tables, because the insurance companies record how long you're likely to live. They gather statistics about how long people live, and that's what they base life insurance premiums on, by life insurance. And this is essentially a life insurance actuarial table for the natural world. Here we Cenozoic bivalves, for example, according to the data that Jack assembled, live for an average lifespan of about 10 million years. So that's pretty good. Insurance companies would probably assign a very low premium to that. But Cenozoic mammals, 1 to 2 years, they probably assign a much higher premium to Cenozoic mammals there. Average species lifespans, about 5 to 10 million years when you sum all of these together and other groups together. But the really interesting thing is that modern biodiversity, when you calculate all this out, the number of modern organisms that we have, that we are aware of, based on the number of organisms that at all periods of time in their history that we are aware of, the fossil record, modern biodiversity is only 2 to 4% of all of the organisms that have ever lived. You would think that it would be larger than that. But all we're seeing in the modern world is somewhere between 2 and 4%. That means that of all the organisms that have ever lived that we know about, that means that 96 to 98% are extinct. So extinction is actually a very common phenomenon. Extinction is the expectation. In fact, Jack's supervisor at Harvard and his colleague at Rutgers in New York argued once in a series of talks and in a couple of papers that taking on the actuaries, putting on an actuarial hat, he was fond of saying that to a first approximation, rounding off the errors, all life on Earth is extinct. And that's what I like to talk to my biological colleagues about. But the important thing is that the fossil record, if you're going to study extinction, you have to go to the fossil record, because the fossil record contains all the data on extinction. And that will become more apparent as time goes on. So here we have the extinction events. These are, if you just look at the extinction intensities, percent extinction through geological time, Paleozoic stages, Mesozoic stages, and Cenozoic stages, then you can see that extinctions are much like sea level. They come and go, much like the tides. They come and go. There are certain intervals that have high extinction intensities. There are other intervals that have low extinction intensities. If we look at all of the peaks that sort of stand up above all of the localized peaks, then there are actually quite a number of peaks. Some of them are big peaks, some of them are small peaks, but these are all the peaks. But there are a few that stand out from the background, and those are typically these. So here are the extinction peaks that I showed on the biodiversification chart, shown just on the data for extinctions. And as you can see, you can get a better sense as to the magnitude of these extinction events when they're portrayed in this fashion. It's interesting that we have even larger peaks back here in the Cambrian. And Norman Newell recognized mass extinction back in the Cambrian. He recognized this peak. But people don't pay much attention to the Cambrian peaks. I pay attention to the Cambrian peaks, but Cambrian peaks never made it onto the list of the Big Five. So it's kind of the Big Five other than the sixth. Cambrian's a strange time. Life is just getting started, and people tend to explain it away as being weird. But nevertheless, we also get an idea that the end Permian was the largest, stands up above the baseline the most. The end ore division actually is quite a large one here. The end Triassic is a big one, is one of the three in terms of the most recent mass extinction events. It's the end Permian, end Triassic, and end Cretaceous. But the end Cretaceous, which is the best studied mass extinction event because it's the closest to our own time, is one of the smaller mass extinctions. Now, one of the things people like to do is to ask questions, well, okay, families in general are one thing, but how many species are we talking about here? And as I've already pointed out, there's no way we can go reasonably out and collect out, just count all the papers that list all the species. Perhaps we will be able to do that when everything is online, but we haven't been able to do that yet. Nevertheless, in 1991, Dave Ropp, whose name would come up along with Jack Sokowski's on a number of occasions in this talk, Dave Ropp devised a statistical way of estimating the number of species lost that would be predicted on the basis of various generic loss. It's a modeling procedure, and like all modeling procedures, it depends on certain assumptions. Nevertheless, you can run the model with various assumptions, and the estimates vary a little bit, but not greatly. And when you run this model, this was the most recent summary of this particular exercise, published by Dave Jablonski in 1995. Then these are the numbers of species losses. This is the amount of species lost that we would predict given these generic losses of generating. We actually can count the generic. Did count the generic. So we have a generic data set. And as you can see, these are very large numbers. We're talking about of fossilizable organisms. This particular compendium is largely marine organisms. It's since been done for terrestrial organisms, and the picture doesn't change when you add the terrestrial data in appreciably. But if we lose, at the end of the Ordovician, if we lose 60% of genera, that's 85% or so of the species. If we get to late Permian, we're talking about 95% of the species are disappearing in this, of the extant species at that time, are disappearing at the time of that extinction event. That's an incredible number. Certainly we would notice that if something like that happened in the modern world. The end Cretaceous, the one that's the best studied, is the sort of poor relation. Only 76 species, only 3/4 of all fossilizable species disappearing at the end of the Cretaceous. But these are truly outstanding numbers and surprised everybody with their magnitude at the time they were first published. So this is the sort of extinction that we're talking about when we talk about mass extinction. Or is it? If these mass extinction events are something different than the other extinction events, because extinctions happen in this particular summary, extinctions are assigned to all of the geological stages, all of the geological periods. So if I take my extinction histogram and I rearrange it in rank order of extinction intensity, then we would expect to find if mass extinctions were a unique feature of the historical record, we would expect to see a break in the distribution that would allow us to separate mass extinctions from other types of extinctions. But when we rearrange these data, we don't see this break. We see a continuous distribution. This suggests to some, including myself, that whatever is responsible for these extinctions is occurring in the environment in a quasi-continuous manner. Simply the intensity is ramping up with respect to at certain time intervals and not at other time intervals. In other words, the intensity of whatever is causing extinctions down here at the low end is less than the intensity up here, but it's a continuum. Probably means that the same processes are responsible for all of these extinction events. We don't have two different classes of processes, so at least there's no evidence in this particular data summary, that we're dealing with different classes of processes in terms of mass extinctions, the big 5 mass extinctions, or other extinctions. In addition, we would expect that the big 5 mass extinction would occupy the first 5 slots here. But when we actually plot the first 5 mass extinctions, they plot like this. So there are other extinction events that are just as intense as the big 5 mass extinction events that are not being counted as mass extinctions. What this means is that history matters. The mass extinction events stand up about background because at those particular times, the background extinction events, and we call these background extinction events, the background extinction events are low. So the mass extinction events stand up above the background at certain times because the background is low, and not so much at other times because the background is high. So history matters in terms of extinction events. We're not dealing with different types of things here. We're dealing mostly with different phases in Earth history, different aspects of Earth history when we talk about extinction events. And what about this term, mass extinction? How is it applied? Well, here we have an extinction event that happened in the Pleistocene about 10,000 years ago, the Ice Ages. Some of you may have heard of the megafaunal extinctions, beasts like these mammoths and mastodons and woolly rhinos and saber-toothed tigers and horses and a variety of other things disappeared from the stratigraphic record at the end of the Pleistocene when the glaciers went away. Didn't disappear, the disappearances were most intense in North America, partially because it's a better studied record, but they happened worldwide. They've been documented worldwide. So this is an extinction event, and it's referred to on a routine basis. Here's a Science magazine, Nature magazine, talking about the end Pleistocene mass extinction. Mass extinction pinned on Ice Age hunters. So this late Pleistocene is a mass extinction. At least the journal Science and Nature believes it's a mass extinction. So now where do you think, on this diagram, where do you think the Pleistocene extinction falls? Falls here. So this term mass extinction, sometimes, you gotta watch this term mass extinction. Sometimes it's used to denote a really big extinction, like the Permian extinction or the Ordovician extinction. Sometimes it's used to mean the extinction I'm trying to impress you with now, irrespective of the absolute magnitude of that extinction. So this term mass extinction is actually used very, very loosely. That's something that you don't pick up in the newspapers and on TV. And indeed, there is no definition of mass extinction. There's no objective definition of mass extinction. I can't write out the characteristics of mass extinction other than to say that it's a big extinction, one of the big 5, except for the Cape Red, which is the 6th. So, what is mass extinction? Nobody really knows. It's whatever you want it to be. We're going to stick with the big 5 as our reference for mass extinction, but other people talk about other extinctions as mass extinctions as well. So what's the pattern of mass extinction? What actually happens during a mass extinction? Well, I'm going to answer that question by looking at 3 different fossil groups. I'm going to be looking at ammonites, and because of time constraints, I'm only going to look in detail at ammonites, but also I'm going to look at dinosaurs because no paleontologist can get up in front of a public audience and not say anything about dinosaurs. And I'm going to talk about planktonic foraminifera, which nobody's probably ever heard of, but those are the organisms that I study when I study organisms, and they're different bits. So ammonites, all you guys know what ammonites. Ammonites come out of the Jurassic coast, and you buy ammonites in rock shops and that kind of thing. One of the problems with studying these mass extinctions is that they tend to occur where the stratigraphic record is incomplete, where there's missing time in the stratigraphic record. That's due to a big sea level regression that usually accompanies mass extinction, and I'll come back to that issue. But one of the only places that we can go to find out what's happening to ammonites at the very end of their time on Earth, at the end of the Cretaceous, is this in northern Spain, especially at the Zumaya section. This is a coastal section on northern Spain. It's right, very popular with paleontologists. There's a nude beach right alongside the Zumaia. So it's very popular for paleontologists to go and do field work. And what we see in Zumaia, when we're looking at the ammonites, is this record. Now, the individual occurrences of ammonites here, this was published by Charles Marsh and Peter Ward in 1996. The individual occurrences of an ammonite fossil are shown here in the red dots. And then the total stratigraphic range are the vertical lines. So as you can see, it's a gappy record. And that will come back to play and to have a significance in our story. But what my eye is drawn to were two things in this diagram. One is that we do seem to have a lot of ammonites that are going extinct seemingly very close to the end of the Cretaceous. That's fine. But there also, we have a greater number that are disappearing well down in the record here. Now, some people would say, well, these don't matter. These aren't part of the extinction event. And the only ones we need to pay attention to are these. Others would say that, well, no, we have to take a look at the whole thing. So that's an automatic dichotomy. But notice that this is a meter scale. This is a very coarse scale. A meter worth of rock, that could be millions of years. So let's take a look at it at a finer scale. This is a centimeter scale now. And as you can see, when we plot the same data, or a portion of the same data on the same scale, on a finer scale, no ammonites reach the Cretaceous tertiary boundary. And this Cretaceous tertiary boundary is marked by geochemical anomalies. So we know that it's worldwide. We know it's the same time worldwide. And this is where the ammonites stop occurring here. Now, because the record is gappy, then we could say, well, actually, we can't be sure that we've actually got the last ammonite. The last observed ammonite might not be the last ammonite of that species. We might be in a gap. So we might have to go a certain distance above the last ammonite to make sure that it's actually gone. So this gets into what we know technically as stratigraphic confidence intervals. So we can put confidence intervals based on this pattern of occurrence. If there are more occurrences of the fossil species along the range, then the confidence interval is low. And if there are just a few occurrences, then the confidence interval is high because the gap is large. Very straightforward. There are lots of statistical models we can play with for that. But when we apply confidence intervals to this data, then we still can't get most of the species of the Cretaceous tertiary boundary record to the end of the Cretaceous. So the ammonites certainly disappeared prior to the end of the Cretaceous. Now, if we start winnowing this data out and just looking at small subsections, we can eventually get it up to coincide with the Cretaceous tertiary boundary. But we have to winnow it out a lot such that it's only a minor extinction. It only involves 5 or 6 species. So that doesn't help us in terms of this idea of a catastrophic extinction. It does look like a pretty gradual extinction. Not only that, but the confidence interval suggests that it may not be, that we may actually see, if we sample the section in more detail, we may actually see some ammonites that occur above the boundary. We may actually see Paleogene ammonites. Now, everybody is taught in their basic paleontology courses that ammonites went extinct in the Cretaceous. But if we look at these data, then we can't rule out the possibility that there may be Paleogene ammonites. And indeed, a few years ago, 2005, more than a few years ago, 10 years ago now, some Paleogene ammonites started to be discovered. Not in the Zumaia section, in a few other sections. But here is the occurrences of the species are here marked with the asterisk and the 0. The geochemical anomaly is stratigraphy below them. So these are good Paleogene ammonites. So as usual, what you've been taught in your textbook, what paleontologists for generations have been taught in their textbooks is completely wrong. There are Paleogene ammonites, and ammonites didn't go extinct at the end of the Cretaceous. They went extinct sometime in between. Dinosaurs. I can't go into the dinosaur record in general other than to say it's the same story. This isn't just the dinosaur data. We have all of the terrestrial vertebrates here in the single section in the world where we know what's happening at the upper part of the Cretaceous. That's in Hell Creek, in Montana, and Wyoming. And this is the record of transitions. The last dinosaur actually occurs, this is a meter scale, the last dinosaur actually occurs 3 meters below the Cretaceous tertiary boundary as defined by the geochemical anomalies. And that's a long time. That's a long time. There aren't any dinosaur fossils within that 3-meter gap. So it appears that dinosaurs were gone prior to whatever was causing these geochemical anomalies and prior to the end of the Cretaceous, in the same way that the ammonites were. My favorite fossils, they're much prettier than dinosaurs and were ammonites. These are the tiny little plankton that float around in the oceans. They're still out there. They still float around the oceans today. Not these species, but other species that look remarkably like these species. And if we look at the planktonic parameter, we know more about the planktonic parameter than we know about dinosaurs in terms of their stratigraphic distribution. We have more sections. We can sample it finer because these are small fossils. And when we do this, then we get the same story. Extinctions happening prior to the boundary, a few extinctions happening generally at the boundary, that's fine. And then survivors that are going up into the Danian. Cretaceous species that shouldn't be in the Danian or in the overlying Paleogene sediments. And it's a progressive extinction event, just like it was with the ammonites, just like it was with the dinosaurs. The only difference here is that we know that planktonic foraminifera survived the event and still survive to this day, whereas dinosaurs, except for birds, which are dinosaurs, and ammonites, didn't survive to the present day. If we look at all of the data, then this is the picture. All of the data from all of the organisms we know about in the uppermost Cretaceous. Then the uppermost Cretaceous stage, here's the Maastrichtian stage, and as we can see, extinction intensities mount up to a peak in the Maastrichtian, and the Maastrichtian is 2 million years long. The Maastrichtian is 2 million years long, so we're subsuming 2 million years here. And then it falls back down into the Paleogene. Remarkably similar pattern to this minor extinction event that took place in the lower part of the Cretaceous, the Albian extinction event. The same sort of pattern that we see here, mounting up of extinction intensity over quite a long period of time. So those are the patterns of mass extinction. That's what we need to explain. We need to, for paleontology, as it is with most sciences, what we need to do is to explain why the observations are the way they are. We can't get away from the observations. If we get away from the observations, then we can make up anything. But the trick of science is to explain why things are the way they are. So, what about these mechanisms? Well, all of you have heard about this mechanism, the asteroid-comet impact. Now, that is usually discussed in terms of the end Cretaceous extinction, but some people, especially the people who discovered the anomalies, the geochemical anomalies at the end Cretaceous, some people originally proposed that these asteroid-comet impacts were responsible for all the extinctions, all of the mass extinctions. And a tremendous amount of work has gone into trying to prove that. But nobody's recovered any good data for any other extraterrestrial extinction, extraterrestrial impact, other than at the Cretaceous, end of the Cretaceous. So it's a singular event. Chicxulub crater, it's called Chicxulub. It's located here. This is not the size of the Chicxulub crater. The usually crater is big, but it's not that big. 150 kilometers in diameter. This is a Bouguer gravity. It's a subsurface structure. This is a Bouguer gravity map. Gravity, variations in gravity you can see below the surface of the Earth. And here we see this multi-ring basin, about 150 kilometers in diameter. That's the crater. Or that's what people think is the crater. That's what it looks like. It's been dated precisely. It's 64.98, which is as close to the Cretaceous tertiary boundary as you're likely to get. And the estimated size of the impactor, based on the physics of the impacts, was about 10 kilometers, which isn't that big, really. But it was it's not the largest crater that we know, but it's one of the largest craters. It's up there, and it's the largest crater that happened at this young an age. So it was a very singular event. Now, what would happen? We know what would happen if one of these impactors came down. one of these. And by the way, this is not the size of the KT impact. It's much smaller. This is atmosphere for scale. But we would expect a whole variety of nasty things to happen if one of these big rocks fell out of the sky. And we now know that there are 300 craters that are known on Earth. These big rocks fall out of the sky, geologically speaking, on not an infrequent basis. The question is whether they cause any major disruption to the history of life. And if they are going to cause any major disruption to the history of life, they would do so through these processes, through changing the environment as, based on these processes. The time scale, even for something big like Chicxulub, would be fairly short, about 100 years, which geologically speaking is a short time scale. So that's what would happen. That's one of the causes. Flood basalt volcanism is another cause that you may have heard of. Here, this is the end Cretaceous flood basalt. These are called the Dakahn Traps. Here's a picture of the Dakahn volcanic fields. Everything in red here is lava that was extruded in about 1 million years. We're talking about something on the order of 1 million cubic kilometers of lava coming out. And that's not 1 cubic kilometer every year. It was episodic. So quite a very disruptive event, and we know that volcanoes, even very small volcanoes, much less something like this, changes the environment, changes global temperatures, changes acidity conditions, affects the environment, and indeed has driven large numbers of modern population extinctions, just small volcanoes that have been going on in human history. Here's the timing of the Dakahn eruptions. We have a major extrusion of lava right at the KT boundary, coincident with the impact. But starting well before the impact and finishing well after the impact. These are the types of effects we would expect. They're very similar to an asteroid impact, but the time scale is different. Time scale for one of these, time scale over which one of these eruptions takes place is several orders of magnitude greater than the time scale for the impact. And we also have sea level regression. Norman Newell and a variety of others believe that these major extinction events were driven by sea level regression. So here, just before the end of the Cretaceous, this is what North America looked like. It was completely covered, almost completely covered in seawater. And at the end of the Cretaceous, there was a sea level regression. All of this drained out. All of this entire sea drained back to about this area down here in Texas and up here in the Canadian Arctic. So all of that habitat went away. And you might imagine what that would do to the local environment, or indeed global environment. This is what the predicted effects would be here, and the time scale of these major sea level regressions is even longer than flood basalt volcanisms, 10,000 to 10 million years, something very long lasting. Here is the sea level curve. This is the Cretaceous sea level drop. It was about 200 meters, a 200-meter drop right at the end of the Cretaceous, coincident with the Dakahn volcanism, coincident with the Chicxulub impact. And we would expect that to have an effect because these sea level regressions oftentimes are associated with mass extinction. And at least in some cases, the end Cretaceous being one of these, then we have a prima facie evidence for multiple causes, where sea level change, where flood basalt volcanisms, and in the case of the end Cretaceous, where an impact were occurring all at the same time. And in order to understand what's going on there, then you simply add up all of the nasty things that were going on, that could go on in the environment as a result of these processes, and add up the time scales. And you get quite a long time scale. But of course, the extinctions happen, based on our evidence, the extinctions happen over a long time scale. And you also get multiple extinction mechanisms, multiple ways in which the environment was being affected. And that seems to coincide with the different ecological tolerances of the organisms. David Robb pointed out back in 1991 that if we're going to understand extinctions, any extinction, we have to look for patterns of coincidence. This is true not just for extinctions, this is true throughout science. This is what experimentation is about. When you do an experiment in the lab, this is what you're looking We can't do experiments with mass extinctions in the lab. So we have to go to the natural world, and but we still have to look at these patterns of coincidence, cause and effect. Pointing out that if all extinction events are different, then we'll never be able to understand what causes any of them. So when we do this cause and effect test, then we note that small extinction events tend to be aligned with singular eruptions or singular variations in sea level, perhaps even singular impacts. This is the impact record. As you can see, there have been a lot of impacts on it. However, the big three for the last 150 million years, the big three are the Permo-Triassic, the End-Permian, the End-Triassic, and the End-Cretaceous, and these correlate with a juxtaposition between a major flood basalt volcanic event and a sea level low stand in each case. There is a very large impact at the end of the Cretaceous, but the end of the Cretaceous is the smallest of these events, of these three events, not the largest. So this to me suggests that we're talking really about multiple. When things come into alignment, then we get large extinction events. When things are out of alignment, we get smaller extinction events, or maybe even no extinction events. So, current status of the controversy, I'll buzz through this quickly. There were a variety of people back in 2010, not too long ago, a variety of people, 41 different scientists, mostly physical scientists, published a review in Science magazine saying that the Chicxulub was the cause of the End Cretaceous mass extinction. And their evidence for that, other than rhetoric, was this. As I hope I've convinced you, the only data that is shown here are these geochemistry and mineralogy, and these data pertain to whether the asteroid impact occurred or not. Nobody has doubted that the asteroid impact, whether the asteroid impact has occurred or not, for about 30 years. So these data show that the asteroid impact occurred. Fine. This is a cartoon. This is not the pattern that we see in the actual data. This is a cartoon of the biotic data. And this is a cartoon of what happened at the Dakahn Traps. I've already shown you much more accurate data about the intensities and the timing of the Dakahn Traps and the species turnover. So the paleontologists that read this paper weren't very convinced, and a large number of us wrote a paper in rebuttal to that, arguing that the simplistic extinction scenario presented in the review has not stood up to countless studies of how vertebrates and other terrestrial marine organisms fared at the end of the Cretaceous. So there's still a disagreement within the community about the interpretation of the basic data, which is interesting from not only a scientific point of view, but also a sociological point of view. More recently, in 2015, there was a paper that argued that the Chicxulub impact actually triggered the Dakahn eruptions. Well, it didn't trigger a whole Dakahn eruption, but it triggered that massive episode of Dakahn eruptions right after Cretaceous tertiary boundary, and that's fine. This is a speculative paper. There's no data, actually. It's just kind of a thought piece. The shocks, the earthquakes would open up the fissures and cause the eruption to be more intense than it otherwise would. Which is fine for me, because that makes the case, as far as I'm concerned, that makes the case for the multiple cause. Of course, that's not how these authors see it. These authors see it as the Chicxulub impact did it. And that this was a bit player, that the impact that the volcano was a bit player. Well, that doesn't sit very well with me. But nevertheless, I think this is a prima facie acceptance of the multiple cause scenario, at least in a mechanistic sense. And the biologists are starting. I've been trying to get the biologists interested in this extinction game for decades, and they're starting to get interested in it. Blair Hedges, in 2013, published a cladogram with 50,000 modern species, looking at their pattern of speciation through time using molecular clock, and started recalculating the species longevities. These are species longevities, the distribution of species longevities, and has refined our understanding of how long species last. For vertebrates, they last about 2.1 years is the most frequent speciation interval. For arthropods, 2.2, very similar. For plants, 2.7, once again very similar. Hedges argues that speciation takes place due to the accumulation of genetic changes in a clock-like way, the molecular clock. And that adaptation is decoupled from speciation. The adaptations that would either confer extinction resistance or extinction susceptibility are decoupled from speciation, which is an interesting scenario. What he does point out is that there's no evidence of major diversification rate changes following mass extinction events. So that suggests that mass extinction events might not have, even when they do take place, they might not have the effect on the biota, at least speciation, the speciation part of the evolutionary story, that we had suspected they would. Our idea was that if everything went extinct, we'd have a burst of speciation. Well, that doesn't seem to be the case according to these theories. And I've been interested most recently in this, in not the extinction events, but the background events. As you can see, there's a definite gradient to these background extinction events. It's almost as if extinction, this is old and this is young. Recent is over here, 0. But extinction is going extinct. The intensity of extinction events is declining through Phanerozoic history. Not only that, but the variance in extinction events is declining markedly between the Mesozoic and the Cenozoic. Now, there are good reasons to suspect that this might be the case. Back here in the early Paleozoic, the Cambrian Ordovician, we really don't get any pattern. This decline actually sets in the Devonian. And that's when we got the first terrestrial plants, which changed everything on Earth. Changed nutrient cycles, changed the atmosphere, changed everything. And here, this change in the variance of extinction, that coincides broadly with the appearance of the modern phytoplankton groups, which changed food webs, changed the stability, the ecological stability of the oceans. So these macroevolutionary factors seem to be reflected in this background extinction event, and it suggests that the modern system may be far more resilient to extinction than we've given it credit for, probably because of the stability that diversity causes. If you have a lot of things around, there are a lot of different ways for plants and animals to make a living, as opposed to when there are only a few things around. I want to get to the last bit, and so I'm just going to go through this really quickly. So the science bit, continuity of extinction magnitudes implies a continuity of processes. Magnitude of pre-extinction events and post-extinction survivorship has been underestimated in many cases. Taxonomic turnover patterns are inconsistent with any single simple cause hypothesis based on, well, that's my interpretation at least, not other people's. Based on current and comparative evidence, it indicates that large extinctions are driven by these multiple events: sea level regression, flood basalt volcanism, possibly augmented by asteroid contact impact in one case. And new molecular biology evidence suggests that mass extinctions may not have some of the macroevolutionary effects that have been attributed to them previously. Now, what does all this have to do with modern extinctions? And should we care about the biodiversity loss based on what we've seen? Well, there are two ways to answer that question. One is to go back to this table. These are the mass extinction events. Nobody questions that these are mass extinction events. We might add the Cambrian extinction in there, but these are big ones. And big extinction events are associated with big species losses. Species losses that we would notice. Species losses that are alarming in terms of provision of services, provision of food, provision of everything that we need. So where does the modern fauna fit in terms of, with respect to these numbers? Well, if you go to the Iucn Red Lists, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the red lists that everybody refers to in terms of, you know, whether species are endangered or not, which species are extinct, which species aren't. And I did this made this compilation in December, so this is current data. These are the numbers of extinct and total numbers of species that we know for a variety of different groups. And as you can see, the percentage, this is not the ratio of extinction, this is the percent extinction. The percent extinction that we've seen since we started keeping records the last 400 years is actually quite small. That doesn't necessarily mean that, that this is a good thing, because the loss of any species is something to be concerned about. But in terms of the sort of losses that we would expect to see in mass extinction events, we haven't seen anything like that yet. And for me, that carries a positive message. That means that despite all the things that we've done to the environment, we haven't really generated many species losses yet. In the, just to take an object example, in North America, right, I'm not from these parts, in North America, we've cut down 90% of our forests. Cleared it for agricultural land, built cities on them, built suburbs. 90% of the forests are gone. How many forest bird species do you think we've lost? 2. This is getting back to that resilience that's in the system. All of our forest bird species that we ever knew were there in North America are still there. Now, populations have gone, populations have disappeared, populations have suffered dramatic declines. But we haven't driven a lot of forest birds extinct despite destroying 90% of their habitat. So there's resilience in the system. That doesn't mean if we continue to destroy their habitat, major extinctions won't happen. But it does mean that it haven't happened yet. Here's where people get alarmed. It's not that the numbers of extinctions that we recorded are that large. It's that the trend is worrying. So this is actually May et al. Wrote the book, but this is actually Georgina Mason's work who wrote the paper that I'm citing here. But there are a number of ways to assess the danger, whether species are at risk of extinction. You can look at species area relations, you can look at red list changes, whether species are moving into a more dangerous category on the red list, and there are a couple of different statistical models you can apply to that. And if we do this, then the predictions are that if things go on unchanged for the next 200 years, 200 to 500 years, then we're going to be suffering major extinction events. That's a worrying thing, but 200 to 500 years is a long time. A lot can change in 200 to 500 years. Half a bird species extinct in 200 to 300 years. We wouldn't want to see that happen, but it's not going to happen tomorrow. And if we change our ways, it might not happen at all. Half a mammal species and bird species extinct in 300 to 400 years. These are long periods of time. It's something that we need to be concerned about, but it's not going to happen. It hasn't happened yet. It's not going to happen next year. I'm not going to come back here next year and say, oh, they're all gone. It gives us time. It gives us time to think about what we might want to do in order to make this not happen, which I view as a positive message. So extinction pros and cons. It's kind of strange to think pros of extinction. But extinction is a natural process. It's normal. Every species eventually goes extinct. Our species eventually will go extinct. So perhaps we should exhibit some solidarity with species that have already gone extinct. Treat them with a bit more respect. Current observed extinction rates are low. So that's good. Those are the pros. We're not there yet. Cons, extinction eliminates things that we value in many, many different contexts. It's part of our heritage. It's part of our sustainability. We need species around us. We can't survive if we don't. Extinction events can have long-lasting effects. We already know that in certain cases when species are eliminated, especially from islands, then things just go to hell. So we don't want that to happen on continents. We don't want that to happen in the UK. We don't want that to happen anywhere if we can avoid it. Current levels of population extinctions and reductions of some taxa are very high, and that's something to be concerned about. And the estimated future extinction rates for some taxa are also very high. If we want to believe the assumptions of those estimates, then that would be something to worry about. Even if you don't want to believe the assumptions of those estimates, it's still a worrying estimate. But it's not a straightforward trade-off. There's some things we have to consider here. Human life can't continue in a planet devoid devoid of a threshold proportion of other life forms. We know that the species that have gone extinct so far haven't really affected things too much, except a few islands. And islands are ephemeral structures. But we have no idea where this threshold lies. We have no idea whether the threshold is at 75% loss, 50% loss, 25% loss, or 10% loss. That's a research question. But we shouldn't make policy, we shouldn't plan our lives based on some knowledge that everything's going to be okay up to this point, because we have no idea what this point is. The costs of doing anything about extinction in the global context are enormously expensive. We're talking about changing the way, the whole socioeconomic context of society. We're talking about living in different places. We're talking about building in different ways. We're talking about really seriously restricting the way we get around. That's very expensive and very unpopular. And money we put into this extinction mitigation is going to be, since it's a zero-sum game, at least in the short term, money put into extinction mitigation is going to be denied to other equally pressing problems. So it's not a straightforward decision. It's a pros and cons. It's a bang for buck. But the important thing is, and what I'd like to leave you with, is that there is time. There is time to make these decisions. There's time to do some more research. There's time to for grassroots levels, for localized species mitigation strategies to get off the ground and have an effect. And I think those are going to be the ones that have the greatest effect. So it's an important extinction is an important natural process. We don't understand it. We need to put more research into this area at all levels, both in the past and in the present, especially in the present. Extinction is forever. We don't want to find ourselves in past the threshold, because once we go past the threshold, we can't bring species back. This whole rewilding and cloning and all this, we can't bring species back. Once species are gone, they're gone. Ontologically is most practical. We need better information regarding the causes and consequences of timing and extinctions, and we need that because increasingly we're going to be managing the planet. Up to now, we've been sort of riding on nature's coattails, but that has been made clear in many, many different contexts. That's coming to an end. We're going to have to start thinking more about what we do, thinking more about the decisions we make at the national level, at the regional level, and at the local and individual levels. And it's really this latter part that I think is going to have the most effect. The planet is currently, and this is the scary thing for me, the planet is currently in a mass extinction-prone state. And the reason for that is that sea level stands low. Sea level is as low now as it was at the Permo-Triassic extinction. And what that means is that anything we do to perturb the environment has a magnified effect. That's the lesson of the past. These extinctions coincide with sea level low stands. The sea level low stands by themselves don't cause extinctions and don't cause big extinctions. But when something else happens and sea level stands low, that's when you get a sea level, that's when you get a big extinction in the past. And sea level is low right now. It's not going to, and even if the glaciers melt and all this, it's not going to rise that much. If we want to talk about how we got that 200 meter rise, that's an interesting question. We might talk about that at the question and answer portion. Humans have been causing major disruptions of ecosystems for the past million years. Ever since humans have been around, we've been disrupting the environment, and we've been driving organisms extinct. Many of those Pleistocene megafaunal extinctions, many people believe that they are down to human hunt, especially in North America. There is climate change associated with that as well, so there's a controversy there. But we've been causing these disruptions. We're perfectly capable of causing disruptions. And through our technology, through our numbers, we're going to be more and more capable of causing these disruptions in the future. We have to start thinking about what we're doing if we're going to avoid what seems to be in store for us in 200 to 500 years. And our ability to cause environmental damage has increased to levels comparable with geological processes. So I I don't particularly buy into the whole economic argument that we have to save species because they perform services for us and we have to buy those services elsewhere if we didn't have species. Who are we going to buy? It's not that kind of thing. It's a moral imperative, and that brings us back to the imperative for sustaining our heritage and for the whole sustainability and the whole heritage conservation argument. Species need to be part of that as well. Biodiversity needs to be part of that as well. Humans have a moral responsibility, I believe, to arrange their affairs as a species for the benefit of as many of your other species as possible, in the same way that we have a responsibility to arrange our affairs to benefit as many people as possible. This is not an esoteric, funny thing. This is what we do. We arrange, we suffer economic declines, we suffer taxes in order to take care of each other. And we need to extend that to start thinking about other things on the planet, things other than human populations, because that is sustaining human populations ultimately. We should not pretend that we can prevent extinction. Extinctions are going to happen. Local extinctions are going to happen. Regional extinctions are going to happen. Even global extinctions are going to happen. They're unavoidable. But by the same token, we should not, through avoidable actions, be complacent in our complicity in contributing to extinctions. We need to, when we do these environmental impact statements, and when we think about what the consequences of our actions are going to be, we need to think of biodiversity preservation in that context. We're not doing that now to any extent like we could. And the thing that really gives me hope is that humans have a demonstrated capacity to rearrange their affairs. And when certain practices become socially unacceptable, irrespective of the economic cost, irrespective of the fact that not everybody agrees, we've seen that with slavery. There were enormous economic arguments. Can't do without slavery. I mean, hell, everybody would be poor. Well, that didn't happen. And it's a better place. It's a better world as a result. We're doing that with smoking. We're doing that with discrimination, with racial discrimination, gender discrimination. We have the ability to do this, but it's not done, actually, it's not done by people passing laws, and it's not done by people on Radio 4 telling us that we should. It's done as each individual decides to do it in the decisions they make in their individual lives. That's how it's going to get done. And we have time to do it. The media, the educational organizations, the research, they're all on the side of preservation of biodiversity. So all we have to do is use those, get the message out, and then change what we do. And I think there's time to save most of those species for a later extinction event that they will eventually succumb to. But hopefully there'll be some speciation events along the way as well. I think that's everything. Is there time? That's basically what I've just said. So I'm not going to go over it again, other than to thank you and to ask if there are any questions.
Thank you, Norman. Questions? Could you give your name, please?
No. And your affiliation.
And your affiliation.
Yes, Katie Simon, I'm a SEAHA student. So you were talking about, one of the slides was saying about birds 50% in 200 to 300 years and other large organisms.
It's not me, that's Regina Mays.
A lot of the species diversity is microorganisms and bacteria.
Mm-hmm.
And we're still discovering so many species within our own bodies. How much is known about in the biodiversity within the microorganisms and what impact on could be having on bacteria?
Yeah, very little because bacteria don't have fur and lick your face when they come walk in the door. We need more. Obviously, there's a lot of work that's going on, especially now that we have DNA sequencing, so we can actually recognize. You see one bacteria, you don't see them all. But we have now the genetic markers that we can actually measure biodiversity among the bacteria. And it's enormous. It's enormous. It's far larger than anybody suspected. Also, the number of bacteria. is far larger. If everything other than bacteria were to be magically eliminated from the planet, then everything on Earth would have an outline, would be here an outline. That would be the bacteria. So we don't have a lot of information about that. We need to have more information about that. But bacteria are very, very tough. Bacteria have been around for billions of years. The bacteria, when people start looking at exobiology and organisms that live in extreme environments, then the first thing they find is bacteria. So bacteria are tough. You have to. I think you really have to hit things pretty hard to get rid of the bacteria. There are the Permo-Triassic extinction, where life, where the megafaunal life in fossil record is 95% goes away. Then some people have said, well, to sell their books, and that's okay. Well, that's when life almost died. But I cornered some of the authors of these treatises and said, aren't you forgetting about bacteria and microorganisms? And said, yeah. But nobody cares about them. So I'm glad you care about them, and I care about them too. But we don't have enough information. I suspect that if we included bacteria, then our biodiversity estimates would go way up. But we really wouldn't have much of a fossil record for bacteria. There are bacteria known in the fossil record, but they take very, very specialized preservation conditions. So we wouldn't be able to tell whether there were more bacteria today than there were in the Cretaceous or than there were in the Devonian or anything like that. And that provides us with, that impedes us in the sense that we can't really establish a long-term context for the bacteria. Nevertheless, bacteria are, we get a lot of services in bacteria. And if they went away, then we benefit.
Questions?
My name's Ian Smith.
And he's an
I
architect.
have no affiliation.
Unaffiliated.
Is that the 300-meter sea level rise? If all the glaciers melted,
There are two ways. There are two ways to get a big sea level. No, one is to melt all the ice that's locked up on land. If you do that, then you get somewhere between a 50 and 75 meter rise. Based on now, of course, in the past there was much more ice locked up on land, and the sea level stood even lower in the Pleistocene than it does now. In fact, sea level stood about 500 meters lower in the Pleistocene than it does now because there was so much ice locked up on land. But that doesn't get you up to hundreds of meters. And the only other way that geophysicists have been able to figure out how to do it, because it certainly has been done in the geological past, is to change the volume of mid-ocean ridges. If you increase heat flow in the mid-ocean ridges, or you decrease heat flow in the mid-ocean ridges, if you increase heat flow, then the mid-ocean ridges will swell, and that will drive sea level up because the volume of the ocean basins will change. If you decrease heat flow, it will collapse, and the volume of the ocean basins will get larger, and the oceans will drain often. Although it's very difficult to collect any empirical data, that's the only mechanistic way that the geophysicists have been able to explain these very large fluctuations in sea level. But since we don't know the mechanism, and in some cases these sea level fluctuations do appear to major sea level fluctuations do appear to have happened over short time scales, and we have no idea what causes them, or what's going on in the deep earth that causes them, then that's a concern. In other words, the sea level fluctuations that we've been estimating are based on thermal expansion of seawater and melting of ice caps. If we add in changes in the mid-ocean ridge system, and right now it seems like volcanic eruptions are getting more frequent on a global basis than they have been for about the last 40 years, then we might be in for some surprises in terms of sea level.
Okay, another question. If there's time, I mean, the trouble with saying there's time to sort out an approach to.
People get complacent.
People get complacent. So do you think there's a role for books like The Sixth Extinction and scaremongering in order just to raise the subject up, the kind of consciousness, I mean, to actually get people to start talking about it?
Well, there's plenty of scaremongering. That's already going on. And it hasn't seemed to work much, work very well yet.
Except that the governments, infrastructure board, and got a natural capital reviews looking at biodiversity, forestry, fisheries, and whatever.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of it based on past experience. I don't have a lot of faith in governments change and then priorities change and funding doesn't get paid and all the rest of that. I think it's far easier for me to see a positive outcome if it's just a social change. So right now you're seeing in restaurants here in London and other places, you're seeing restaurants starting to advertise that they only source their fish from sustainable fisheries. If that got going big time, then that would take the pressure off of a lot of fish populations. But that's not going to be a government. That's not going to be a government initiative. It's going to be people making decisions that they're not going to order that. It's as simple as that. A lot of this is just as simple as that.
That's quite an easy thing to decide. Whether you're going to eat this kind of fish or not. Whether you're going to decide whether to have a house, whether you're going to build a little green belt. Because we need houses close to London.
Again, it's a personal decision. Nobody forces anybody to go into a house. Well, I suppose councils can assign people to go into houses. But if people just say no, we're not going to do that, and there's a lot of support for as you know, Greenbelt controversy. There's a lot of support for people who don't want a Greenbelt touch. There are lots of
those are people who are already living.
I live in the Chiltern Hills, and there's a lot of support for people who stockbrokers who already have nice houses there, and they don't even want a train to go past their house. But it gets down to a personal decision that it becomes, and I think Britain is far better about this than the U.S. For example, in Britain, 90% of the people live on 10% of the land. So in Britain, you like to huddle together. So whereas there are vast suburbs that sprawl all over the place in the U.S. because in the U.S. not only do we need everybody needs a house. It's not bricks and mortar because most of the houses are made out of wood. But people want a couple acres around the house as well. You don't see that as much here in Britain. So here, I think places like Britain, places like China, there's already a tendency of doing that. And more people live in cities now than live in houses. Part of the problem is to make the countryside sustainable, make the countryside accommodate living, life, species. But we're seeing that as well too. We're seeing species come back where they didn't exist, where they'd been driven out. And people, that's a popular thing. People like that. It's just a matter of getting people on, getting the word out that you don't have to sacrifice your lifestyle. You don't have to sacrifice. You don't have to make major sacrifices.
So how would you do that?
Keep doing what we've been doing, but also get out to the schools, organize programs. Happens at the grassroots. How did people stop smoking?
Well,
it became
we stopped the ozone hole.
It became socially unacceptable. It just became socially unacceptable. It wasn't an acceptable thing to do. And that's how you stop it. And it can happen very quickly. We just look at what's happening right now with gender discrimination, and people get the word, and then it suddenly becomes things that were taken for granted suddenly are questioned.
Norman, I'm going to step in at this point since you've paused,
Yes.
and I think you in particular, but everyone has earned a drink.
Okay. I won't object.
But before I do that, don't we owe him a round of applause?